file, is the best one.
Yeah.
It's on the podcast, right? So the
Right.
quality has to be decent for this.
Got it. Let me just get somebody to stand this phone up so I can put the microphone near me, and there we go. And it's on. Okay, so it's recording now. So worst case, I'll send you this recording too, so you can decide which one you want to use.
Yeah, it'd be good to have it either way.
Yeah, no worries.
First of all, I'm just curious. How long? When did you move to Canada from Uruguay?
I was 1, but I went back to Uruguay to live there for about another year and a half when I was around 9, 10 years old. And then I went back to Canada. So by 11, I was basically settled here. And yeah, since then, I've just been living here nonstop.
Did you pick up Spanish?
Yeah. I grew up speaking Spanish with my family almost every single day. So yeah.
So, and just through this heritage, you've just been very interested in Uruguayan history.
Yes, ever since I was a kid, even in Canada, like I would meet my uncles and they would just tell me. I had an uncle that was really into football history, so he started giving me books on it, and I just became fascinated in general. And then after that, growing up, I started getting a job, and I started getting resources online. DVDs started coming out on eBay, and eventually I started getting my hands on books. When I went to Uruguay, I went to this really old pawn shop that had tons of history books, like really, really good stuff. So I just collected all those. And even until today, I'm still reading stuff on Kindle, stuff that was recently published even, just on football history all over the place, anything I can find.
That's great. Yeah. I'm limited to English, and we have some decent books, but none of them are just on Uruguayan football, And you have Galeano, which I'm sure you know well.
Yes.
He's written his, Stockholm Sun and Shadow.
Yeah.
But there's a lot there there are a lot of gaps to fill really. So I've already done. This is going to be a podcast series about the team from the very beginning until the World Cup.
Okay.
So we don't include the World Cup. It's just the Olympics.
I see.
And the idea was to run this just ahead of the Olympics in Japan this summer, which isn't going to happen, but we're going to run it anyway.
Okay.
And then, just to, try to talk about, it's fascinating that they have 4 stars on the shirt, right?
Yes.
And they won 2 World Cups, how did this happen?
Yes.
Who are these players and so on?
Yeah.
So that's the aim. So I've done some decent research already. Of course, you're going to know more than me, but that's kind of the point as well. So I'm just going to throw a few questions at you and see what you can do.
I have about just a look. I told you before I'd written a few articles on this, so it turns out it's about 13 pages, but I took some notes, so I highlighted everything. So it's because I did the research around, actually, funny enough, in 2012, when they qualified, I think it was the first time in like 80 something years, to London, 2012. I did this. I just kind of read it through a few books that I had. Particularly this one here. This is like a really, really rare one. It was made for the 100th anniversary of the Uruguayan Association. And I think maybe the best Uruguayan historian, Atilio Garrido, he wrote this book, and it's incredible. Like, it actually has primary FIFA documents, like, scans of the Constitution, like really, really official stuff, and it's all over the place. Anecdote after anecdote you can imagine based on those 2 tournaments. So yeah, I got a lot of this stuff from here actually, and yeah, I think it's very good. It's very good stuff. But like you said, it's only available in Spanish, so it is very difficult for people to access this type of information. I understand that.
Yep. Right. So let's get going.
Yeah.
These are quite general. I'm sure there's lots of stuff here to say, so you'll just have to condense it as well as you can.
Yes, I'll try.
But how long in general would you say it took for football to become the most popular sport in Uruguay?
Pretty quickly. So the Uruguayan Association was established in 1900, and I think the big first event, there was a win against Argentina for a cup called the Copa Aldao. Sorry, mistaken. That's actually a club competition, but it was there was basically like a cup winners' cup between the 2 league winners that became very, very popular at the beginning of history. So we're talking the first decade, from 1900 to 1910, although the tournament went on for much longer, until the 50s. And then yearly, there was the Copa Lipton. That was a yearly match between Argentina and Uruguay. And essentially, for the first maybe 10 years of their history, they almost exclusively played each other. And because they were playing Argentina, the big neighbors, they were always aspiring to just sort of match Argentina. Argentina was always a little bit ahead of Uruguay since the beginning. But when they got their first big win against Argentina, that was a moment that I think people really started to pay attention to football. And from that moment on, the club game was exploding. There was, the rise of the two big clubs from the beginning. And that eventually led until the inception of the Copa America. At the time, it was called the South American Championship. That happened in 1916. So off the bat, right there, you already had an international event that people could look forward to. And that contributed massively to the growth of football, particularly in 4 countries. It was Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, and Brazil. And if you see pictures of the time, I mean, we're talking crowds of 30,000, 40,000 for Copa America matches, right, from 1916, 1917 even. So you can really see that it was growing massively, the sport in Uruguay and in South America, almost unknown to the rest of the world. That was the thing.
Is it possible to say anything about how it spread so quickly?
There's so essentially a lot happened through the immigration that was occurring at the time. And there's a documentary called The Origin of Uruguayan Football. It was released last year, 2018. And in the documentary, they explained that essentially the British, it was the what's it called? I'm trying to think. The traders, right? The ships would arrive to the coast in Buenos Aires, Rosario in Argentina. Those were the 2 main spots, and Montevideo. And they just took notice right away. I suppose they just they took a liking to football from when they saw right away. And you can even see there's evidence that they were inviting British teams from even 1906, 1908. They could not compete with them yet, but they were drawing massive crowds. So there was a big interest in football, I think also because it mixed all the classes, particularly in Uruguay. Uruguay always sort of prided themselves that they sort of open football to every facet of society, every race you can imagine, from mestizos, European based, everything. So I think that's sort of, Uruguay is a very small country. At the time, it was even less than today. Today's about 3.5 million. Back then, it reached a bit over 1 million. So, news spread very, very quickly. Uruguay is sort of a country where people say everybody knows each other in that sense. So whatever event was big at the time really took like a national fervor. There was a lot of coverage on it. And the game just spread like wildfire, And I think one of the things also is because it also spread so quickly in Argentina, it made it popular in Uruguay as well. Uruguay tends to do that sometimes. Whatever is popular there, they bring it over. So there's a lot of factors, but I think you can't pinpoint the rise of football as an in Uruguay phenomenon only. Like I said, they were always looking outside, and whatever they saw, they sort of brought back in, and it sort of fed into itself, the enthusiasm of the game as it was growing, through these early international competitions.
You said something interesting, that it was open to all kinds of classes.
Yes.
Because I know in Brazil it was an upper class sport at the start.
Yes.
Is there any particular reason why it was so open to everybody in Uruguay from the very beginning?
From what I understand, reading the history of Uruguay in general, Uruguay always saw them, even like now you can really see, and I sort of noticed this with smaller nations, but they've always tried to stand out by being progressive. So, they gave the vote to women very, very early, I believe even earlier than Canada. And for them, it was, Uruguay's a small country, small communities. So I think they just integrated different aspects of society, right? The different races. They started bringing in players. They noticed these players were excellent. And like I said, they lobbied to have these players participate as early as they possibly could, which happened actually in the first ever Copa America in 1916. One of the first matches ever, Uruguay played Chile, and there actually was, this is recorded at the time, there was an uproar in the Chilean media because they claimed that Uruguay was fielding African players who were actually born and raised in Uruguay. So they went to the CONMEBOL at the time to try to get Uruguay disqualified from that match, which is sort of a famous anecdote that even now Chileans and Uruguayans kind of joke about. That actually happened. So it's a lot of the bantering in the culture of football actually brings that incident, that game. So just to show you how strange it was to see a black player at the time, the fact that they brought it to CONMEBOL Chile kind of says it all in that sense,
There's a guy here who I'm interested in. There was a president in the early 20th century called José Bartolé Ordóñez.
Oh, Baje, yes.
Yeah, is that his nickname?
Yeah. Sorry?
Is that his nickname in Uruguay?
Oh, no, I think, his last name is Baje. I think is just a pronunciation of his last name, yeah.
Oh, okay. So we're talking about the same guy, José Bartolé something?
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure it's the same one because I know that generations later, his descendants actually, were involved in politics in Uruguay heavily. So the family goes way, way, way back.
Right. So apparently what I've read, he was inspired by the way the British had used football to improve education and health and so on. And he wanted to. I think he owned a newspaper or something, and he wanted to use sport for a similar use sport in a similar way in Uruguay. I don't know if that makes sense or if that resonates with what you know.
So I don't know that. Ironically, I don't know that about that in terms of in the context of Uruguayan football history, but I do in the context of Argentinian history, and that might reflect back into Uruguay. So I know that in Argentina, a lot of the early clubs were based on these sort of church-based community centers. And even in schools, they were pushing football because they just saw it as a healthy way of expression for the youth. So a lot of the leaders in the early history of South American football were actually, you would see it was a priest, the priest was running the club. You know what I mean? So I think football was seen, they saw the value, the physical, emotional, virtuous value of the game. Funny enough, you must probably know this, but in South America, years later in the 70s, 80s, they had that there's that sort of a win at all cost. Some teams, it's tends to happen, but in the early game, you would read stories about Copa America finals where a goal would go in through a handball, and the team that did it would actually admit it right away, and the whole stadium would just applaud. So there was an association with football with that virtue, sort of, the respect. They did like that the game brought that tradition with them. So I do assume that, that probably was something that the British passed on, and they just took a liking to it. But I know that for sure in Argentina, but I never actually confirmed that in Uruguay. I would imagine it probably is the case as well because of that.
It's interesting because you had all these teams from Britain paying a visit to Uruguay and Argentina in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
And as you said, the Uruguayan teams lost pretty heavily.
Yeah.
But can you say something about what effect these tours had on Uruguayan football?
I know for sure that they were so. When the first British teams would arrive, they would people would actually go over the top with tactical analysis. They really wanted to learn how to play. So even though, there was actually one game where I know they lost heavily, and I wish, because I was focusing more on 24 and 28 when catching up on the history in this sense. But I know that in one game they lost heavily, and after scoring only one goal, the crowd lost their minds as if they had won the game, because it had been already many, many matches in a row where they couldn't even score. So any sign of progress was heavily celebrated in that sense. So yeah, they definitely were looking towards the British to learn how to play. Teams like even clubs that exist even now, Bolton Wanderers, they did a tour in South America. So they would visit Argentina, then Uruguay. In that sense. So there was a lot of, they definitely put the British on a pedestal, like they're coming here to teach us how to play football. This happened, I think, before there was sort of that deviation where, the River Plate style sort of developed on its own, sort of a different style of play. But at the beginning, definitely they looked up to the British, to teach them essentially how to play football.
So if we take it forward to maybe 1916 or 1920, in a few years before they go to the Olympics, what kind of playing style have Uruguay adopted by this time?
So the playing style was seen to have been developed by Argentina and Uruguay, but in general, Argentina was more known for this type of playing style. And I actually took a quote from the book. It explains something interesting, and I don't know if this is derogatory, but they said that when they went to the 1924 Olympics, the idea was that the Europeans were playing, and I quote, rugby with feet. So apparently it was just very direct, straight physical, crashing through opponents. This is what was written, and I do take this with a bit of skepticism because, like I said, this is only one point of view of what happened. But the way that the Uruguayan and Argentinian style was described was essentially the beginning of what we consider to be, I suppose, a more modern iteration of football. So, for example, we had, short passes, give and goes, players moving around and actually rotating together, like in a synchronized fashion, defense splitting through balls, crosses. They were doing a lot of short touches back and forth. Apparently, from what this narrative states, that had never been seen before. So that was the idea, right? That they had developed that style of football, sort of reinforced by the Copa Americas, of the 1916s and into the 1920s.
And what about the self-esteem of Uruguay at that time? I mean, they had won the first Copa America,
yes,
right? In 1916.
Yes.
The years where they got hammered by all these English teams were over. Where did Uruguay sort of rate themselves in the world elite?
They were actually terrified of going to the Olympics. Absolutely terrified. The endeavor was it had never been done before. So this was the first time ever a South American team was going to travel to Europe. What had happened was that Uruguay had won the 1923 Copa America. They won it at home against Argentina. And essentially, Atilio Narancio, he was a delegate, and he spearheaded the idea to go. Everybody thought he was crazy. They didn't even know if they could get the money to go, and they thought, what if we go and get absolutely humiliated? So the idea was, we're doing fine in South America. We can play Chile, Brazil, Argentina, but there was no idea of what they were going to meet when they got to Europe. So the self-esteem was, I believe, cautious. The first time they actually started to gain a sense that they could compete was at the beginning, because before the Olympics, they went on a 9-match tour all over Spain. This was done to actually pay for everything, to pay for their lodging, the food, the trip, everything they had to do. So when they played the games, they actually won 9 matches in a row. They beat teams like Athletic Bilbao, they beat Atletico Madrid. And these weren't even small matches, to be honest. One of the matches against Atletico Madrid, for example, the King of Spain, Rey Alfonso, actually attended. And they filled the team up with players from Barcelona. And I have other teams here actually mentioned. But just to show you how seriously the game was taken in Spain, they saw it as a reflection of their national honor. Like they couldn't lose, they didn't want to lose to this new team arriving from so far away. After winning those matches, though, Uruguay, I think, went into the Olympics in 1924 with an elevated sense of self. They at least knew they could compete in Europe with, the professional clubs at the time.
Is it possible to say something about what kind of men these were, the players in the team?
Yeah, they were. Well, the thing was, in Uruguay, professionalism arrived in 1930. So these guys were all workers. I mean, they were, for example, José Nasasi, who's, Uruguay's captain, throughout the whole era up until 1935. He was working, I believe, as a marble. I have it here. He was a marble worker. And what happened was he was actually notified he was going to the Olympics during his shift. I mean, just to show you how different things were, he was literally working, and they're telling him, listen, we're going to the Olympics. Like, oh, okay, great. So, these guys were all working men, all of them. You had Hector El Manco Castro. He's a very famous player in Uruguayan history because he was missing his arm. Actually, a part of his arm was missing. That had happened in a work-related accident, like while he was, even playing. So, it's the players were all, they had to work to make a living at the time. Football was not, but I do know for sure that they took football very seriously. They did take it as like a lifestyle. They were training constantly, maybe almost on par with what we would consider professionals at the time. But like I said, they had their other jobs to do. So one of the big worries was actually, how are we going to be compensated when we go to the Olympics? Like, we're not going to be paid for this. So, it was a very interesting time in that sense. A lot of obstacles that obviously we didn't see after even 1930.
This is about I'm really curious about, and I've read some stuff about it, but I know you're going to have probably more detail than I have.
Yeah.
Can you just take us through the moment they left the harbor in Montevideo?
Yes.
Until they arrived in France, because that's quite a journey, I believe.
It was, yeah. So they, when they first left, they actually got the cheapest boat they could buy, which was actually a third-class vessel. And as they were leaving, so it was, there was a lot of expectation. It was considered a very historic moment. They were actually trained on the boat by the goalkeeper, who was Andres Massali. He was only 21 years old at the time. And Massali was actually a South American rowing champion in 1920, I believe. So he was considered sort of the expert in physical conditioning. So, the fact that the actual goalie was in charge of all their stretching and conditioning and training and everything on the boat is very interesting, I always found. But yeah, that's essentially what they were doing. The trip took many months for them to arrive. And they finally arrived to Vigo in Spain, to actually a massive reception. There was a lot of people waiting for them at the time. So I think there was a bit of excitement at the novelty of, who are these guys? They're coming from South America. They speak Spanish. At this point, they had already organized for these friendlies to play. So, they were arriving to Spain for that particular reason, right? But like I said, when they arrived, yeah, there was definitely some fanfare in that regard. Yeah.
And then they had, was it a long train journey from Spain to?
I'm not sure about the train journey, actually. I'm not sure. Actually, I don't think it was actually heavily covered in the book. There were other journeys covered. I could talk about the final. They actually walked all the way to the stadium in the final, which was about a 50-minute walk from where they were standing. In Argenteuil. They did it on purpose. Yeah, they did it on purpose, actually. In the final, before they faced Switzerland, they walked for 50 minutes doing this Uruguayan style of music called murga, which is a very drum-based, and they were singing and chanting and everything. And they did it from the beginning. They were staying in a castle in Argenteuil, and they went to Colombes, which took about 50 minutes. And I checked on Google Maps just to see how long it actually took. So they did the whole thing walking, just to sort of, pump themselves up, but also, I guess they also attracted attention from the locals in a sense. It was sort of because for them it was a massive event, right? To be in an Olympic final for a country that had never participated ever before in that sense.
I don't really know where to start with the Olympics, because most of the stuff I know is like, I know the results, and I know that people were shocked at how good they were. Nobody could find Uruguay on the map and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
And there was one story. I think the only story I have from it is that and I don't know if it's true, but that Yugoslavia sent some kind of scouts.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So before the first match against Yugoslavia, so you have to remember this was a direct knockout competition. So imagine taking, months of voyage and you lose one match and you're back home, imagine that. So what happened was Yugoslavia sent 2 spies, which apparently were recognized quickly by the Uruguayan delegates or the players. So what happened was the Uruguayans purposely staged a practice, which was total comedy. The players were shooting balls 20 minutes wide. And I'm actually reading this from the accounts of the time. They would screw up simple touches, miss open nets, head the ball backwards. They would actually bump into each other, the players, to show that they were completely, uncoordinated. And essentially, the Yugoslavians took this display totally seriously. And I don't know where this quote comes from. It's often mentioned in Uruguay. It could be in maybe a report, newspaper, something. But the Yugoslavians wrote, after witnessing the practice, "We are saddened that these young South Americans are so clumsy and awkward. They have come from so far and will have to return after the first game." So famously, we know that the game ended 7-0 at the first match against Yugoslavia, which I'm sure must have been quite a bit of surprise for them to be taken by surprise, right, to such an extent. But yeah, they did that on purpose. Obviously, no one really knew how Uruguay played. No one knew what to expect. So they kind of used that to their advantage, I think, at least to get through the first round, right? So, using that lack of information at the time about them.
From here on, in terms of the 1924, I'm just going to ask you about, the most memorable parts from your end, like your personal highlights from that tournament, because I just don't know what you're sitting with.
Yeah, well, okay. So essentially, the next round over, they beat the United States 3-0, and there's actually a lot of interesting little anecdotes. This is what I really enjoy about the history more than the results. So essentially, they went to a bar after beating the United States 3-0. And they met with the Spanish team there. Now, the Spanish team were the only people who had actually seen Uruguay play, right, because of the 9-match friendly tour that they went right throughout Spain. So the Spanish players assured them, they said, we think you guys are going to be the champions. And they said, apparently that was the first time when Uruguay actually considered, because they beat Yugoslavia and they were just trying to survive the tournament at this point, right? They didn't know if they really had it to go all the way. So that was a really, really big moment to hear the Spanish tell them this at the bar. Let me see, actually I have quite a few, what's it called? Oh, one of the famous anecdotes is that as soon as Uruguay started progressing, word of their style of play started taking off. So this attracted a lot of people. A lot of reporters started going to where they were staying at their homestay, including a lot of women. So there's actually a first person accounts, journals and everything in these books of the players writing in detail saying that they would be turning away women all day, like lineups of women coming at their door, because they felt that this could be history that they were making. So they started noticing sort of the importance of what this could mean for the future of Uruguayan football. So yeah, there's actually a lot of accounts of players just saying they were coming one after the other, usually to see Andrade. He was one of the big stars at the time, but one after the other, turning them away. So the players were, they were definitely, in that train of thought that, trying to focus solely on the tournament, really, really taking it seriously at this point. The semifinal, a lot of people actually say that, there's a lot of, when you hear the narrative told casually, they always say that, Uruguay just kind of ran through the tournament and won very, very easily. But I don't think that's actually that true, because in the semifinal, they barely beat the Netherlands with a very, very dodgy penalty that was won by Hector Scarone, who was Uruguay's, top striker of the era. So Uruguay ended up winning the game 2-1, and the Netherlands were so furious that they appealed to FIFA to have maybe the game reversed. It wasn't, it was dismissed, right, their appeal right away. But that bad blood, funny enough, actually carried over to 1928, where the first game was Uruguay against Netherlands. And the press immediately was bringing up sort of that dodgy penalty. They were sort of bitter from 4 years earlier. But that game was considered apparently very physical. And reportedly, the Uruguayans were struggling a lot with that. Sort of, and here's the thing: when you read that in football books, they explain very physical. Sometimes it's hard to imagine because they're not very specific. I think it's a very calm term to use when you don't know how to explain something in general. Like, they're not really going in detail with what do you mean by physical? Was it man-to-man marking? What was happening here, right? You know what I mean? So after that, anyways, that was the semifinal. Uruguay ends up going to the final against Switzerland. So I explained a little bit earlier that they walked all the way 50 minutes to the stadium in Colombes. And the players actually kept singing and chanting and drumming in the dressing room. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the Swiss were right next to them. So the Swiss were sort of alarmed by this. Actually, the word is said here, alarmed. They didn't know what to make of the singing and chanting and everything. So they knock on the door and they politely ask if they could stop the singing and all that partying. The Uruguayans do. So seemingly at this moment, there's sort of an eerie silence that falls on everybody, where they kind of realize, oh my God, we're in the Olympic final. And the nerves really started creeping up. Reportedly, there was a silence of maybe 10 minutes, very, very awkward silence, until one player called Pedro Sea, who's a very famous, he's maybe one of the top 5 icons of the era for Uruguayan football. He picked up a French magazine called La Fille, which had pictures of nude women, right, in the magazine. And he just sort of opened it and said, does anybody here know how to speak French? And that joke apparently caused the whole dressing room to explode in laughter. And reportedly, that's what sort of calmed the emotions right before the match. So heading out, they were much calmer, almost laughing still at that moment, which I believe was more with sort of the breaking of the tension, right, that caused. I guess it was a very timely joke in general. But the match went on, and Uruguay ends up winning the game 3-0. After the match, they do the whole thing. They give you the gold medal, they do the anthem. After the anthem, they found that the fans were still applauding them. So the players decided to do this thing, which was walk around the stadium and just sort of wave at the fans. This was pretty much the birth of the lap of honor, which was done, on the fly. Which later on in South America, I'm not sure if you know this, and in Spain as well, when you do the lap of honor, it's known as the Olympic turn, the Vuelta Olímpica. And the reason it was dubbed this was specifically because of this moment. So, some people wonder, why the Olympic turn? We're just doing a lap of honor 100 years later. It's specifically referencing this lap of honor, right? That was done in Colombes in 1924. So, yeah, so quite a bit happened. And obviously, in 1924, a lot of traditions carried over after that.
Yeah, those are incredible stories. And then Uruguay came back as heroes, I imagine.
Oh, yeah.
In Uruguay.
Yeah, absolutely. It was pandemonium when they came back. And they were sort of the talk of the town. Right away, as soon as they arrived, Argentina threw a challenge to have a two-legged friendly series, which happened between September and October in 1924. So right after the Olympics, right? Argentina they really wanted to play Uruguay. And just
So what was the sentiment in Argentina like? Was this like this little brother of us have suddenly become a world champion and now they wanted to... I don't know. They show up in the West, I don't know.
So the two friendlies are very, very famous because the bad blood that was. So essentially, the idea that I get from these books that I've read and the documentaries that I watched was that Uruguay was sort of not prepared for the type of match that Argentina had challenged. The first game in Uruguay ended in a 1-1 draw, and it was sort of, a regular affair, friendly, etc. But the second game is one of the most famous, maybe in South American history. There were so many incidents. So as soon as they arrived, they played in October. And actually, no, the first time they played, the second leg, the match was canceled almost immediately because fans invaded the pitch. They felt maybe they were just a little bit aggressive, the fans, who knows. This match was played in the Estadio Barracas in Palermo in Buenos Aires, very nice neighborhood. So the match was postponed. They eventually replayed on October 2nd, 1924. Now this is a really big one. The police in Argentina built a fence around the stadium to sort of prevent the Argentinians from running into the field again. And the fans were apparently very, very upset at this. So they started mocking the fence by calling it the Olympic fence. Just, mocking it, almost like saying, oh, the Uruguayans, they need protection from us. Before the game, the Uruguayans, a lot of the times, there was a lot of politeness in football. The Uruguayans walked around the stadium, kind of doing a little lap of honor. And that was the actual official moment that it was coined, the Vuelta Olímpica. So, a lot of people reference the 1924 Colombes one against Switzerland, but the actual moment that it was coined was by the Argentinian press when they did that. So it was also in response to the Olympic fence. So everything was the Olympic something, making fun of them, right? The Olympic something. That game actually has the first ever Olympic goal. So the ball literally was shot from a corner. And, for those who don't know this, in South America and in Spain, any Spanish-speaking country, whenever you score straight from a corner, it's called an Olympic goal. This is the reason why. It was so unheard of when the goal went in that the Uruguayans actually protested the goal as if it was sort of it was a foul or it was something that was not supposed to happen. And, the goal stood. And again, mockingly, the Argentinians and the press, they called it the Olympic goal. The name just stuck forever for many, many, many years. But Argentina ended up winning that game 2-1. And there was a lot of violent incidents in that game as well. Reportedly, Andrade was unable to take a throw-in multiple times throughout the match because the fans, even though they were fenced, it was not detailed as if maybe they were throwing things, but it said that the fans were preventing Andrade from taking a throw-in. So imagine how tense that match must have been. And yeah, this match definitely led to a lot of bad blood in the upcoming Copa Americas and definitely going into 1928. So the rivalry was sort of taking up a new notch because of that supposed bitterness. Some people, one side of the narrative would say supposed bitterness, who knows, right? But definitely they were not seeing eye to eye in that era, especially after 1924. It was a very, very big game changer in South America, for sure.
Is it possible to say something about how big the 1928 Olympics became for those two countries?
Oh, absolutely. So Argentina, they end up going to 1928 as the South American champions. They had won the title in 1927 in Peru, beating Uruguay actually in a very, very dramatic final. So what happened was, yeah, they both went to Amsterdam, right, for the 1928 Olympics, and Argentina essentially, I mean, once they arrived, they seem to have a very easy time of it. I know if you see Argentina's score lines, they're very, very wide margins. Right? I think they beat Egypt in the semifinal by a large margin. I believe they won their opening game 11-0. I have it somewhere written here that they did that. But what happened was, okay, for 1928, one of the big changes was that a lot of it was focused on physical preparation, which had never been the case before, right? So, for example, Uruguay actually sent their food order 5 months ahead of time, which was considered, even at the time, was baffling. Like, really? Wow. They took this experience from 1924. So they sent what they believed to be a very Uruguayan breakfast because they didn't want to upset the stomachs of the players. The breakfast was, in simple terms, milk, bread, and butter. That's it. So imagine they were micromanaging to such an extent that even months before, right, they're planning their diet, their food, and everything. This was seen, at least in the books that I read, it was considered a bit ahead of its time. Like, it was ambitious. Let's say the word ambitious. It had never been done before. Clearly not for the Copa Americas, right, to have that level of preparation. So, the tournament actually, I mean, just to fast forward a little bit, the final had a ticket demand of 250,000 for the second final. They actually had to do a replay, Argentina and Uruguay. So just to show you, imagine this, 1928, 250,000. I mean, it's almost mind-boggling. Just to show you how big sort of the news went. I mean, there was a lot of anticipation for this final for Uruguay, Argentina. They just sort of both met, right? Especially considering their rivals and all of this. And the novelty factor was also huge too. So, I mean, just to show you, yeah, it was considered massive for both countries. Here's the thing. I don't know if you want me to start from the final because there's a lot of anecdotes about that final and how it was followed, or I can go throughout the tournament itself if you want, because there's quite a few anecdotes that I could tell about.
Let's take it from the start.
Okay, I'll try to sum them pretty quickly though, because there's not that many games, right? Uruguay maybe I think played 4 matches. It was round of 16. Netherlands, I believe. Quarterfinals was Germany. Semifinals was Italy, and the final was Argentina.
Yeah, I almost only have the results. The one thing I have is that the Netherlands were very keen on revenge, and there was a huge demand for tickets.
Yes, yeah. The match against the Netherlands had a crowd of 40,000 people, and yeah, there was a lot of anticipation. The documentary mentions that too, of course. So basically, I was mentioning a little bit before how, physical preparation became sort of the theme of this Olympics. Uruguay would have these very, very rigorous training sessions. They trained for 80 minutes and then would run for an extra hour because they were afraid of playing 120-minute matches. That was the idea, that they had to be used to 120-minute matches every single time, which by today's standards, I don't know if that seems like overexertion. That might be dangerous to do, to run, let's just say, over maybe 3 hours a day or 2 hours a day, just to prepare for that. So the first match actually against the Netherlands, they won 2-0. But then after that, Uruguay actually suffered a lot of setbacks. So one of the players, Pedro Petrone, got sick, and another player, Martinez, he actually had appendicitis. So Uruguay was already losing a few players due to, external circumstances, let's say. The quarterfinal, though, is a very fascinating match. They ended up playing Germany. And this is actually known as one of the most violent matches that is ever spoken about, at least in Uruguay. So, and interestingly enough, you'll actually be a little bit surprised to know that the Uruguayans were not the aggressors of this match this time. So what happened was the match was considered extremely violent, and reportedly, from the sources I've seen, the Germans were just hacking away. They kind of went into the match with a win-at-all-cost attitude. In fact, actually, one of the delegates compared the Germans to the Argentinians in that match I spoke about before, the fence match, right? The violent game. They compared the emotion of that match as a war, essentially. So the match is finishing, and one of the most extraordinary stories I think I've heard from Uruguay's whole history happens at the end of the match. Uruguay was winning the match 4-1, and they decided, you know what, we're going to give them back everything they gave us. So Uruguay starts attacking the German players. They were hacking at them, fouling very, very hard. The whistle blows, and apparently a few fights are breaking out. So players are being separated by the referees, and a lot of stuff's going on. Suddenly, José Nasasi, who was Uruguay's always very calm, collected captain. He runs up to the German captain, Hoffmann, who was considered apparently one of the instigators of the whole match being violent, and he punches him in the face, knocking him out, okay? As soon as the German captain falls, Nasasi realizes that he could be suspended for the rest of the Olympics, and he drops to the floor himself. Suddenly, a Uruguayan doctor notices what happened, and he runs up to Nasasi, who's on the floor, kind of pretending he's knocked out. And this is actually verbatim screaming. He says, "This is serious. Someone bring a stretcher. Someone bring an ambulance." That was basically done to sort of cover up what had been done, and that caused the necessary confusion so that FIFA later on was sort of unsure of what happened, and they ended up actually delegating the suspensions to the federations. So the German federation ended up suspending Hoffmann for a long time. It was actually quite a big ban. And the Uruguayan Association only suspended Nasasi, hilariously, for one match. So essentially just missing the semifinal. So, I mean, it's really, really a crazy story. I just couldn't believe it when I actually read that actually had occurred, that the doctor had, thought of it so quickly and he just ran up to, I mean, it's like a circus, it was just like a comedy, like playing out in that sense, right?
It's Latin intuition,
You know what it is? It is actually mentioned that in a documentary as well, they do say that, there's like, they're very proud in South America of that, they call that the viveza criolla, it's like basically, like you said, Latin intuition, right? The cleverness, like in the moment, very quick thinking, very quick cleverness. So anyways, this led to the semifinal, which was Uruguay against Italy, but without Nasasi playing. Nasasi was in the crowd. So Uruguay ended up winning this match 3-2. There is a bit of an interesting anecdote at the end of the game that I always liked myself as a football fan. Not as crazy as the other one, though. Essentially, the match was considered extremely physical. I mean, they were giving it to each other, both teams. But it was done in a very respectful way. I'm not sure if you ever played a game where, the referee starts letting things go and both teams are hitting each other, but without the intention to injure. But there's sort of that mutual respect, you know what I mean? That I'm giving it to you, you're giving it to me. Reportedly, as soon as the final whistle blew, both teams had this very emotional embrace in the center of the field, Italy and Uruguay. It's said that the Italians were very sympathetic towards Uruguay because, as you probably know, a lot of Uruguay's players have Italian descent. So you have, names like Scarone, Nasasi, Petrone. These are, their grandfathers could have been from their own villages, you know what I mean? Or even their fathers. So they're very, very, first generation Uruguayan or second generation, right? Very, very, they had come from Italy not too long ago. That was the idea. So there was this sort of this sense of brotherhood between them, especially at the end of the match, right? When they actually embraced in that sense, right? In sort of, harmony, I guess. So yeah, this led to the final, which was Uruguay-Argentina. The first game was an absolute disaster for Uruguay. They had to hold on 120 minutes with 3 players injured. And at the time, there were no substitutions. So you can imagine how very difficult was the idea, almost hopeless in the chance to win the match. So as soon as the match started, Nasasi and Scarone pulled a muscle, but they played the rest of the game, and reportedly they could still compete. Hector Castro, though, who was the man without the arm, he actually had a serious injury and he couldn't even walk, and he had to stay on the pitch for 120 minutes, literally limping on one leg or dropping on the ground in front of Argentinians to try to stop them, because that's all he could do. So Uruguay essentially held on 120 minutes, and yeah, that led to the second match, which is the decisive game, right? The second match was the one that I said had that ticket demand of 250,000. So this game is actually very interesting. The way that people followed the match in Argentina and Uruguay was through telegraph. So people actually filled all of downtown Buenos Aires and Montevideo, and they set up these big booths of radio stations with a telegraph. So the telegraph was, arriving directly from Amsterdam. And literally they would, I don't know, something would happen in the match, and maybe 20, I don't know how long it would take for a telegraph to arrive to South America. But literally people were waiting with, the Morse code, and they would get the little slip and they would have to read it with a megaphone, like, okay, it's 0-0, 20 minutes in, and people were following the game that way. But just to show you how huge this was, that, this caused people to try to follow the game essentially live, right? Almost, or as much as possible, right? At the time in South America, in Argentina, Uruguay. So the first goal actually comes from a very famous telegraph that is actually, it's very, very mentioned, especially in Argentina and Uruguayan football cultures. So it says, Argentina is attacking, goal Uruguay. And what this stated was that Argentina was dominating the game until this point, but Uruguay caught them on a quick counterattack for the first goal. So that's why that contradictory telegram that had arrived, that is essentially the meaning of it, right? And it's like I said, it's very, very well known. Like you can almost speak to any Argentinian journalist, they'll know about that telegram. I'm not even sure if it was read in Uruguay only. That could have been actually read in Argentina when it was done. So the game was 1-0. Argentina ends up tying the game 1-1. And then Uruguay ends up scoring the winner in the 73rd minute. Now, this moment is actually one of the most famous plays in Uruguayan football history because a player essentially screamed, he yelled at his teammate to shoot the ball to score. But the yell he made was very audible. So I'll bring it to the beginning of the play. Essentially, Uruguay was taking a corner kick, 73rd minute. The ball's rising, and then Uruguay's player, who was called Borjas, what he does is he rises up, pretending he's going to go for a very powerful header to the net. And then what he does is he leads two Argentine defenders to mark him, and he screams, Tuya Hector, which means it's yours, Hector. So essentially it was a dummy. He heads it down to Hector Scarone, Uruguay's top striker, who was kind of walking into the area at this point, right, the box, and he just blasted it like a volley right into the net. That Tuya Hector, it's yours, Hector, is... I mean, it's like gospel in Uruguay. Like they even add that quote to popular music, to songs even. It's very, very well known, that moment. Reportedly, the Argentinian players, everyone heard that. It was sort of like a very audible moment when he scored that goal, that scream, right? So, like I said, that sort of remained in the lore, right, of the football culture ever since then, right? That moment. So yeah, the game ended up that was it. That was the winning goal. It was a 2-1. And that was the last time that football was played at the Olympics until 1936, actually. 1932 was not allowed, apparently under the demands of FIFA. They said the World Cup had come already. We don't need a tournament to decide anything like this. When the tournament returned in 1936, it was established that the IOC would be running it under the supervision of FIFA, but that specifically FIFA actually says that it would not count as a world title anymore. It's specifically an Olympic event. It's an amateur event now. You know, they wanted to distance themselves from the Olympics after 1928, essentially, FIFA. This is what happened.
And what was the reaction in Uruguay and Argentina to this final?
I think a little bit of what's it called? Argentina definitely felt like they let it slip in the first final. You know, essentially, like I said, they were playing against a team of 10 men with 2 men with a pulled muscle, kind of competing at maybe 50%, let's just say, capacity. So there is a feeling, I've read this before, that Argentina, they should have won it in their first game. Argentina felt like they were the superior team in going into that final, actually. Like I said, Argentina had recently beaten Uruguay a year earlier in the Copa America final, right? The 3-2 in Peru. So there is sort of that idea that, they should have won that game. And they definitely took that sort of, I won't say resentment, but that regret, they took it into 1930. 1930 seemed to be a World Cup with the narrative built, at least, with the European teams that ended up going. The narrative was definitely built between Argentina and Uruguay. It seemed to, like, sort of an inevitable, there seems to be, at least by historians, this sort of a clash is going to happen eventually between both of them. Funny enough, in 1930, both semifinals, Argentina won 6-1 against the United States, and Uruguay won 6-1 against Yugoslavia. So even again, there was even the scorelines being similar, leading into the final, built into the narrative. People really paid attention to those things at the time.
I was going to say, I was going to ask the last thing. What is this team's status in Uruguay?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you probably know about this, but Oscar Tabarez, he ever since he took over the national team in 2006, he sort of revolutionized the youth system. So basically, players who are under 15, they have to go to the Uruguayan football complex once a week to train there. But when they train there, they're surrounded by just paintings and posters of all the teams in history. So they, one of the teams that is most glorified is that team, that era of that team. I mean, it wasn't just, what they did for football. It was kind of what they did for the country. One of the famous quotes it was that Uruguay is no longer an insignificant dot on the map after 1924. But that team was just considered so legendary because, they ended up winning 3 Copa Americas and the 3 Olympic / world. I mean, we can get into that later, but titles in a row. And some people even consider 1935 Copa America to be part of that generation that was already aging by 35. So technically, you can even say 4 Copa Americas and the 3 titles, and that was just one generation. So it was really unheard of. You had almost a generation of 4 or 5 all-time genius players. For example, Hector Scarone. Even Argentinian journalists that I know, that he's often quoted, and I say this with skepticism because anytime I see something written in a Uruguayan history book, I say, okay, what do the others think about this first, right? But he's often quoted as was the best player, best forward in the world. He ended up going to Barcelona, I believe in 1926 or 27, and he scored, I think it was 17 goals in 18 games, which Barcelona fans now even say is like one of the best ratio return for goals ever. And he ended up going back to Uruguay for many reasons, right? Like at the time, homesickness. There could have been an issue with eligibility because technically you're a professional if you were playing in Spain. There's a lot of have to do with that. So he wanted to play for the national team. He didn't want anything to potentially impede him. But like I said, there's this one generation of maybe 4 or 5 like all time for Uruguay, like talents. And the team is, it's just, it motivated every subsequent generation. So the 1950 players were looking back at the 1924, 28, and 30 players. They would literally, it was like they were thinking of that legacy that they had to equal. For them, it was like, they even say that, Gijia, when they won the 1950 World Cup, that they were more emotional because they were true to the history. They, paid homage or tribute to that generation. It's called the Olympic generation. Because like I said, they have there's such a sense of glorification, their, mystique around that team. And like I said, everything after that has essentially been inspired by what that generation accomplished. And funny enough, it kind of leads into the next one. So, like I said, like imagine the 1970s generation was inspired by 1950, but 1950 was inspired by the 1920s. So the inception of everything, sort of the spirit, was the 1920s for sure. That team. And it still permeates today. I mean, people actually often joke about how often Uruguayans talk about history as if it happened yesterday. There's a teacher once, I read a really interesting blog that he went to Uruguay to work for about a year, and he couldn't believe that there was kids, like 14-year-olds, having screaming matches, arguing about, a Nacional Peñarol game from 1918 and whether the 1921 final should have happened. They know detailed, and, you'll see this often. Like random Uruguayans will bring up 1932, 1935, like actual lineups of the teams. I mean, they really do, they really do accentuate or I guess they try to pay homage or remember really in detail. It's a really big trait amongst Uruguayans to remember that far back, like I said, as if it happened yesterday. It's still very alive, the spirit of what happened then. They love going into that narrative. I realize that a lot when talking to people or, just in general. You watch television shows, talk shows about football. It's always about history. Always, 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 So, yeah.
Well, I have nothing more to add. Alvaro, is there anything more you think we missed, or anything that really belongs to this story that we haven't covered? Or I mean, it's been very comprehensive. From your end.
I guess if there was like a logical continuation to this, it would be. It depends how long you want to cover. You stated that you wanted to cover only until 1930, right?
Yeah, we're not going to do the World Cup.
Yeah.
It's going to be too much now.
Yeah, for sure.
I know. I've written about it before. I know more or less what happened.
Okay.
I'm sure there are a lot of anecdotes there as well. The reason I actually found you on Twitter was because of this. I don't know if you know the guy who does the research for the World Cup in 1930.
What is his name?
He's on Twitter. He has like a special 1930s project.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, he's wonderful. Yeah,
he has research on it.
Yeah, I think he's actually, if I'm not mistaken, because I know there's two accounts dedicated to, America. It's like America's Team 1930. I think one of them is actually like a great grandson of one of the players who played in 1930. Right. I think this could be the one that you're mentioning, actually, you're referencing. So yeah, no, I definitely know him. Actually, he often sends me incredible like material, like stuff that you think you couldn't find anywhere.
Bulk of 1930 project.
Yes, that's exactly. Yeah, he's really good, very dedicated. I really like that account.
It's really good.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I guess if you were to add anything, I mean, but this is, I think, for another show altogether. It's the logical continuation of this is, essentially when people say, why do they have 4 stars? Like, is it true that 24 and 28 are considered official titles? I did quite a bit of research on this too, and there actually a recent book was published on this. Maybe when I say recent, I mean relatively recent. It was 2010, I think, by a French writer called Pierre Arrighi. He's actually French Uruguayan. And his research is phenomenal. I mean, we're talking actually, Football France issues from the time. Everything's written. FIFA constitutions, like he uploaded everything. And essentially he argues that, FIFA had almost complete autonomy in 1924 and 1928. And the reason why they're considered official titles is because they managed through a set of loopholes to have the best players of the era in 24 and 28. That was not the case in 1920, funny enough. So this is why there were actual debates about this. And in the Constitution, it actually does say, for example, in the 1950 revision, that Uruguay are 4-time FIFA champions. Then 1984, there was actually a 100th year FIFA book, basically 100th celebration of FIFA. 80th anniversary. And in that book, it mentions multiple times that, the 28 and 24 tournament were equivalent to the World Cup. It's very interesting why sometimes I find that FIFA wants to mention it, or acknowledge it, but they don't want to talk about it. And it's very interesting, I find. For example, you remember Egypt and the last World Cup, right, in 2018. Okay, Egypt's crest has 7 stars because they won 7 African Cup of Nations. And one of the things is that FIFA actually has to allow you to have stars on your jersey for the World Cup. So they made an alternate crest, Egypt, because they couldn't have any stars on that. So this probably would not have been reported anywhere in the world, but in Uruguay, they definitely took notice. And for them, it was like, almost like banging on a pot, like, see, you know what I mean? See, guys, FIFA's letting us keep our stars. We're 4-time world champions. So in Uruguay, it was extensively covered all over Twitter, everyone's mentioning it right away. So, I mean, there's a lot to really cover about this. But like I said, I think it's for a different podcast altogether. It's a very interesting topic. I did notice a lot of people on Twitter once. There was an American journalist, I believe his name was Grant Wall. When Uruguay had the national anthem against Portugal, he tweeted, it's like, oh, how disgraceful that they're wearing 4 stars. Like, this is embarrassing, blah, blah, blah. And, I mean, people just bombarded him. I remember at the time, there was, absolutely almost a nationwide fury at this guy, right? And people were, uploading documents and FIFA this, FIFA that, the Constitution. It was really, really funny. But like I said, there's definitely a bit of controversy about that. But it's for another time. But a very interesting topic nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other stuff that you are you've read up about, just for another time maybe?
Oh yeah, well I'm fascinated with Uruguay's football history. I have been since I was a child. I grew up in Canada with North American sports for the first maybe 6-7 years of my life, and it took me going to South America to really start appreciating football. My father was always a fanatic, but it was very difficult to watch football at the time. I think they would show one Serie A match a weekend, and that's all you could really get. Yeah. So ever since I started learning about the history, even though I was raised in Canada, I became fascinated. Just the whole history of it. 1950, when I first heard of it, it blew me away. I was like, what? 200,000 people? What? This happened? I couldn't believe it, right? I was like, what? Okay, well, they're done there, right? No, they were 4th in 1970. What? So there's a lot of history, a lot to cover. I'm basically fascinated by everything. The whole, they're celebrating this year the 120th anniversary, the Uruguayan Federation. Football Association, I meant. So yeah, I really can probably go in depth about anything, even 1950, 54. Oh, '54 itself, that World Cup, many consider that to be the best Uruguay team of all time. They didn't win it. They went to the semifinals. Incredible. I mean, the game against Hungary in 1954, you could probably do a whole podcast on that match because it is fascinating. There's so many anecdotes. A player pretty much died on the field and was revived and played the extra time. I mean, it's really incredible. And he ended up scoring the tying goal. So I mean, we're talking. Yeah, it's really fascinating. There's a lot to cover for sure.
Well, we love the 1950 final.
Yeah, final. Yeah, no.
We haven't made any plans to do anything on it. That's yet, but at some point down the line, I know we're going to do something on it. So.
Well, if you guys ever
back up again.
Well, if you'd have me, I'd be glad to do it for sure. And I appreciate the invitation. And I would love to talk about that tournament, of course.
Amazing. Well, I can't really thank you enough for this. I mean, I use like maybe 50% or 40% of the interview, and everything seems great.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I need to make sure that we do some talking as well on the podcast. But it's been really, really good, and thank you so much for all the anecdotes and all the insights.
No, for sure. We'll keep in touch, and again, thank you so much for the invitation, and I look forward to hearing the podcast later.
Yeah, it's in Norwegian, but I'll send it to you regardless.
Yeah, for sure. Whenever you can.
Also, I'll send you my phone number.
Yeah.
Are you on WhatsApp?
I am. Yeah, for sure.
It's a good way to send the file.
Yeah, absolutely. I do that often actually. So that's perfect. I'll send it to me. I'll send you a message, and then we'll just be connected there.
Brilliant.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much once again.
No worries.
I'm sure we'll be in touch at some point.
For sure. All right. Great meeting you.
Thank you.
Take care. Oh, it's so funny. I mean, I just love it. It's just Pedro Petrone, right? Like Petrone, Nasasi, right? So there was a feeling of